we go. My name is Nancy Clasby, and I'm very, very grateful to be here tonight. And I wanted to start with a moment of silence. To make conscious contact with a power much greater than anything we could ever imagine with our intellect. And as we begin to still and slow down, it's much easier to make contact with a power greater than ourselves. You can listen for the stillness around you and imagine that you could draw that stillness inside of you, letting go of before and after, yesterday and tomorrow, the past and the future, and lovingly invite yourself into this moment right here, right now. And then very gently come back into the room, and I'll begin to share my experience with all of you. I have a lovely man in the back that's changing the slideshow for me, so if you could go to the next slide, that would be great. So there I am. When I was a little girl, I wanted to be a mother. That was really what I wanted to be. I thought it was the most important job in the entire universe. And I knew that I would be calling these little spirits into my life. And so there's a picture up there of me with my children when they were younger, and now they're all young adults. I have a son that's 31 and two daughters, 28, 25. So when people asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, I thought that would be the most wonderful job in the world, and it really was. I loved being a mother. I loved raising my children. Since 1998, I've worked as a healer and a meditation teacher. I have taught meditation workshops to groups smaller than this and much larger than this. And it's been a privilege of mine to be a member of the Greater Boston IANDS since 2012. I'm a recording artist of healing meditations and an author of a book called The Reluctant Mystic, Autobiography of an Awakening, that I wrote in 2016. So that gives you a little bit of a background on me. Tonight what I wanted to do before I begin to tell you what happened to me was I wanted to explain to you a little bit about Kundalini. And so instead of a near-death experience, I wound up having a spontaneous awakening that was called a Kundalini Awakening. And at the time that it happened, I really had no language around it, so I didn't know what had happened. So I wanted to just share a little bit about what Kundalini is. Kundalini is a term from the yogic tradition for the power of the divine. She is the latent female energy believed to be coiled at the base of the spine. It is Kundalini who creates the universe. She's the creator of all creations. Sometimes she's called the face of God. Imagine that, the face of God. And through my presentation, I'll be using that word God interchanged with other words. I was born and raised Jewish, and so that's the word that I feel comfortable with. But I do know from the inside out that language falls short of that experience. So whatever you feel comfortable calling a power greater than yourselves, please feel free to interchange that word. She is the ultimate goal of all yogas, the awakened mind, and the transcendent vision of saints and sages. By knowing her, all is known, and life is saturated with bliss. So she is known as the mother who gives birth to all of creation, the creator of all creations. And every spiritual tradition has a way up that mountain to the top. And each tradition has a different set of language, rituals, that lead, I believe, up the same mountain and bring you to the same place. Christians call her the Holy Spirit. Jews call her Shekhinah. Chi is the word used by the Chinese culture describing the life force energy that permeates the universe. Bodhicitta in Buddhism is the mind that knows empathy and compassion for the benefit of all beings. Spiritual seekers of all faiths, shamans, yogis, monks, priests, nuns, and many more ask to be shown the way to her. As a Jew, for me, I saw her as a bright light, and that's in Judaism, that's pretty much the way it's depicted, is of this incredible bright light. I know that this energy source that I call God is so intelligent that it will show up for different people the way they feel most comfortable. So if you were raised in the Christian faith, you might see Jesus or Mary. If you're raised in the Buddhist traditions, you might see Buddha. For me, I saw this incredible, incredible light. So if you, you're already there. You're a little ahead of me. So a little bit more about Kundalini. These are some of the ways that the Kundalini may rise inside of you. And the next slide will show you a picture of the way they think Kundalini works. In the center of your body is an energy, like a tube that's called the Sushumna. And on either side of that central channel, they believe that there's two snakes that are coiled. And through the rising of the energy in your body, the snakes slowly start to unfurl. And as they unfurl, they open up the energy centers in your body. And you might have heard the word chakra, which means wheel of light. And we have 7 major chakras that run through the body. They're also all over. There's hundreds of them all over the body. But for the purpose of this lecture, you can imagine the snakes unfurling and moving up through the center channel until finally the Kundalini arising comes up and out through the top of your head. So here are some of the ways that Kundalini may arise. Sometimes it comes about through a ritual specifically designed for the transmittal of power, like an initiation, which I believe baptism is the Christian form of that transmittal. But there's also other traditions and spiritual rituals that bring about that occurrence. Through various yoga practices developed from thousands of years ago, prayer, devotional practices, selflessly serving others, chanting, meditation, mantras, ritual, dance, drumming. There's all different ways to bring about that energy. What happened to me was a spontaneous awakening, so I was not on a path that was seeking an awakening. I had never really heard the words Kundalini arising. I was a mother of 3 young children. My children were 3, 6, and 9 at the time, and I was incredibly busy. So spontaneous awakenings can occur through a near-death experience, which I know a lot of people in this organization are familiar with. Sometimes it happens through extreme pain or trauma, which also can happen with a near-death experience. One-pointed concentration, which would be through meditation. In the dream state, given through an initiation from a wise being, so you go to sleep and then you have a dream of someone transferring this energy to you. And this is what happened to me. It's even possible for one to have been initiated in a past life and have signs of the awakened Kundalini in this life without any recollection of the past life transmission. So for me, the way it was explained to me, because I kept thinking, well, why did this happen to me? I mean, I'm so busy. I have these 3 little kids. Like, could you pick someone else? I just don't have time for this. But what it was explained to me was that I had studied for many lifetimes before, and then when I incarnated into this lifetime, I wound up having the spontaneous awakening right before my 40th birthday. And in Judaism, the mystics, the Jewish mystics that studied the mystical Jewish texts, the Kabbalah, were not allowed to study those mystical texts until their 40th birthday. And the reason for that was because by that time, it was thought that people would be more grounded here. They may already have life partners, homes, jobs, children. And so for me in this lifetime, the awakening happened right before my 40th birthday. And so it's kind of combining all my different past lives from different spiritual traditions. Though Kundalini Awakening is the greatest prize on the spiritual quest, the blessed soul receiving the grace is on their way to the realization of the highest process. But this is not without peril. So when a long time after I had the awakening, I got language around it, and I started to learn more about Kundalini. And there were many, many accounts of people having spontaneous Kundalini rising or transmitted through ritual or dance, or people that had an intellectual foreknowledge of what it was and were seeking it, which was not my case. But very often, once the Kundalini starts to rise, and if you want to go just to the next, you can see a picture of someone right there over on the left. You can see the energy centers kind of popping out, and do you see what's happening on the top of that figure's head? That's what happened to me. It felt like my head had blown off the top of my head, off of my body. But if the Kundalini doesn't rise all the way up straight through the Sushumna and clear all of the energy centers as it goes along, it can get stuck in an energy center. So I've had people that have come to see me that have had Kundalini rising that went sideways. So it got stuck in one energy center. And I had a man over the last few years that's been coming to see me on my healing table, and he was a very successful businessman. He had a wife, he had 3 children, and when he had this spontaneous awakening, the Kundalini got stuck in some of his lower energy centers, and he had excruciating back pain. He wound up leaving his wife, abandoning his children, walking around the streets of Boston. He gave all his money away. He spent a lot of time lying on the floor of a friend's apartment, looking at the ceiling. He wasn't sleeping. He wasn't able to care for himself. So it can be a very, very uncomfortable, almost dangerous experience if you're not led through the process with a spiritual teacher or a Kundalini master. And for some reason, what happened to me as a result of that seemed to really flow really smoothly and easily for me. And I was led to the right people to talk to. So that perilous experience did not happen for me. For me, it was ecstatic bliss. So just a little bit more about the Kundalini rising. The purification or the transformation that happens, or that happened to me, was, as I said, I had incredible amount of bliss, which is also called Ananda in the Hindu language. There was a profound peace, an internal knowing of interconnectedness for me. Everything melted. So if you want to just move on to the next one, I can start to really explain to you about what happened to me. But before I do that, and I'm sure that a lot of you might know this, I wound up going to 3 different teachers. One was my rabbi. One was a Catholic nun who fell in love with her Monsignor, and then they both left the Catholic Church and became Episcopalian ministers. And then a wonderful doctor, a psychiatrist who was of the Hindu faith, who lives in Calgary in Canada. And he has lots of awards and runs the Center for Integrative Medicine for all of Canada. So those were the 3, and I'll explain to you how I met them, but they each decided separately on their own that I had had what was called a mystical experience and that I was living the life of a mystic. So I wanted to explain a little bit about the difference between a medium, a channel, a psychic, and a mystic. So a mystic might have all the experiences of a medium, a channel, and a psychic, but not necessarily. And I've had all of those experiences at different times. And just a little explanation, a medium is someone who has chosen to be the medium between the living and souls who have passed on to give comfort and closure to the living. A channel is someone who allows a spirit to merge with them, thus allowing the spirit to speak through them. A psychic is someone who uses extrasensory perception to identify information hidden from our 5 senses. But I had a mystical experience. A mystic is someone who has a direct experience of creation and the interconnectedness of all life. So a mystic oftentimes receives the gifts of a medium, a channel, or a psychic, but not always. But the most important message for the mystic is that we're all here. And there's an internal knowing that what we do to ourselves, we do to each other, and what we do to each other, we do to ourselves. So I wanted to read a little bit about my awakening. Thank you. When I was a little girl, I was at about the age of 12, I had an unbearable pain in my back, and it made it so that I couldn't stand or walk or sit. And I spent a lot of time lying on a hard floor. I was tutored at home. And from the ages of 12 to 16, I waited. My neurosurgeon didn't want to do any surgery to see what was going on. They didn't have MRIs at that time, so they really only had x-rays. They couldn't see what was going on. So for 4 years, I was in unbearable pain. And during those 4 years, I learned how to do things like astral projection, to leave my body to get out of the pain. So at first I started by moving to the ceiling of my bedroom, and I thought, wow, this is really cool. I can look down and see my body. And then I thought, I'm going to try and go a little further, and I moved outside of my parents' house, which was on the ocean, and I started flying around the ocean, and I thought, wow, I can get away from my body. And finally, at the age of 16, I had my first back surgery. And I did pretty well for a long time, but by the age of 18, I had already started a yoga practice way before anyone was doing that. So that was over 40 years ago. And I started going to see alternative healers. I started seeing an acupuncturist, and the only acupuncturist in all of the Boston area at that time was a Chinese man who did not speak any English. No one had ever heard of acupuncture. I started doing all kinds of healing arts to see if I could help with this intense pain. And I believe that we get that pain. Our body is what allows us to find out about the really big stuff, the real important things in life, like letting go, compassion, forgiveness, surrendering, acceptance. And I learned a lot from my back pain. I've had 2 more surgeries since that first surgery in the exact same spot in my back, L4-5. Just a little piece of that disc would come out and push on a nerve so that I couldn't stand up. and it was crippling pain. But I learned so much from it. I learned to move into the center of the pain, and if I could stay in the center of that pain, I would come through the other side of it into this incredible place of peace and stillness. Because when you're living with a tremendous amount of pain, the physical world really fades away. When you are always, sometimes I call it pain jail. When you're stuck in that spot and you can't do anything, the only thing I could do was start moving through breathing exercises, doing breathing exercises, and moving through the center of that pain and getting to the other side, which was quite beautiful. So I had 2 more surgeries, like I said, one around my 50th birthday, and then one a few years ago around my 60th birthday. And it was around my 40th birthday. So what happened was I started going to see an acupuncturist that I had known and a new massage therapist, and I was going every week for both treatments. And it was the right time for me, but what happened was over a period of 6 weeks, my body started to shake, and I didn't really know what it was. It felt really blissful, but I didn't know what it was, and in fact, I was embarrassed because I didn't know when it was going to happen. If I could be anywhere out in the world, and my body would start spontaneously shaking. Many years later, I learned that that was the microcosm of the universe vibrating inside of me. The shaking continued for 6 weeks, and at the end of 6 weeks, I had what I know now and have language around it was a spontaneous awakening. And I wanted to read to you a little bit about that awakening, just one chapter from my book. The experience I was having is beyond the limits of language, but I'll do my best to explain it. I was having what I now know was an out-of-body spontaneous awakening, a transcendent experience. I saw 2 visions going on at the same time. So I was on the massage table, I was looking up at the ceiling, and I could see there was a tin ceiling in there. But at the same time, in my third eye, which I later learned was my third eye, which you can sometimes feel if you put your finger right up here in the center of your forehead, it might feel a little bit ticklish or a little bit warm. Sometimes people can feel it right between their eyebrows, and I usually feel it in both places. It is the center that is the seat of intuition. So I had this vision going on. I saw the physical world with my naked eyes, but I also saw a vision that was like watching a movie inside of my head. And the movie was an incredible, all-encompassing light. It was inside of me and outside of me. It was everything and nothing all at once. I was in it, it was in me. It took my breath away, and it was so brilliant that I couldn't really look at it full on. I could not, they say we can't look at the face of God. I couldn't look at it full on, but it was all powerful, all knowing, all wise, and not at all scary. And I felt completely accepted and loved exactly as I was in those moments. I felt like I was truly home. I felt all of humanity in those vibrations, and I knew from the inside out that we're all connected. I understood the truth of being alive in a human body and all that our lives present to us. On that day, I felt an unconditional, all-encompassing, all-knowing love. And this love was so enormous that it blew apart the physical world. It melted everything. So it lasted about 45 minutes. And when I got up off of that massage table, and in case any of you are wondering, the massage therapist really had no idea what was going on because it was an experience that was happening inside of me. I had to sit out in my car for about an hour. But I had a really hard time because, like I said, it felt like the physical world had melted. So I couldn't figure out how to put my key in the ignition. I couldn't figure out, it felt like I could put my hands through everything, and I couldn't really grab the steering wheel. And it took me a long time to figure out how to get the car to start. But at the same time, I was in this state of complete bliss, so I wasn't at all afraid. I just was very accepting and so connected. And on the ride home, I noticed that I could see life force energies around everything and everyone. So if I looked at a tree, I could look at the outline of every single leaf, and I could see what was moving, which were these vibrations that went like this, out and together and out, these beautiful vibrations, and I could see light around everything that was alive. And when I started driving through our little town, I could see people outside, and I could see energy fields around them, and I could see people that were maybe in love, and it looked like there were big pink puffy clouds around them. I could see people that were sick, or people that were in some sort of a altercation. I could see their energy fields were really constricted. I thought maybe I was in a Disney movie. Everything was colorful, and everything was bright, and everything was vibrating. And I finally got home, and I'm not really sure how I got home, but I did get home. And it took me a very long time to try to figure out how to maneuver in the physical world. Now, remember, I have 3 little kids at home. I couldn't figure out how to go to the grocery store. I couldn't figure out how to open the refrigerator. So you can see how this could be confused with a mental illness or a psychotic break. But at the same time, it wasn't scary. I was so full of this unconditional love, and I remember looking in the mirror and looking into my eyes, and it felt like I was swimming into my spirit. Like I said before, for the first time in my life, I saw who I was. I saw how incredibly beautiful I was. Forgiveness poured out of me for all of my character defects and all of my challenges, and this incredible love encompassed me and held me. And I was full of forgiveness. So we have a little cartoon up here that I like that says, you see the 2 monks that are sitting there, and one says to the other, "Nothing happens next. This is it. This is it, the awakening. That's it." So there were a lot of things, again, that could have put me in a mental institution those first few months. First of all, I didn't tell anyone about it for quite some time because I really didn't know what to say to people. And I was so engrossed in what I was seeing that it didn't seem to matter and I was at home with small children, and they were right there with me every step of the way. I didn't eat or sleep for 3 months after that awakening because I was being fed, and I know a lot of this is going to sound like this is fantasy or fantastical thinking, but I just have to tell you right up front, I am so pragmatic. I'm organized, I'm clear thinking. My life went along pretty smoothly. I married the man of my dreams who's here tonight. I had these 3 beautiful children. It wasn't perfect by any means, but I lived close to my family. I had my family around me. I lived in the town that I grew up in, a beautiful little seaport village north of Boston, right on the ocean. So a lot of the things that I'm going to tell you are going to sound like maybe this is somebody who's really kind of lost her mind a little bit. And I wasn't one that was, and there's nothing wrong with this, but I was not a seeker. I didn't go to psychic fairs. I wasn't someone who was looking for answers. I didn't have time to look for answers. I had these 3 little kids, and I was incredibly busy. So one day, I sat down on the side of my bed and I turned on the television, which was an unusual thing for me. And anyone who's raised small children knows that there's just really no time. And by the time the end of the day comes, I wanted to sleep. But I turned on the television. I had a quiet moment. And there was a 1946 Gary Cooper movie on the television. And I only saw one little clip of it. So I know it was there just for me. And Gary Cooper is in the movie. He gets taken to the top of a mountain by a spiritual teacher, a lama. And even though there's no time or space when you're outside of your body, for the purposes of the movie, some time elapsed. The lama goes back up the mountain to get Gary Cooper, and Gary Cooper launches into this monologue, and he says, I went to this place of incredible beauty and light, and I wanted to stay there forever, but something was calling me back. And I thought, oh my God, that's what happened to me. That was it. That was it. That was the language I needed. So that day, that afternoon, I called my rabbi and I said, can I come see you? And he's also a dear family friend. And I went over to see him, and we went for a walk around the block, and I told him what had happened to me. And I said, do you think maybe I went crazy? He said, no, I don't think that happened to you, Nancy. Now, he told me later on, he was thinking, well, maybe she went crazy, I don't know. But he said, I'm going to meet with you tomorrow. And he went home and he had to call some colleagues because this was a very unusual story. And he said, you know what, come back to my office tomorrow. And we started talking, and he said to me, Nancy, you had a mystical experience. And he started giving me examples of mystical experiences in the Torah and in the Bible, similar to when Jacob climbed the ladder to heaven. And he gave me some books to read about the experience I had. And that was all I needed. I just needed a few words. I couldn't put it into words. I went to the library because it was before the internet, and I couldn't look up Kundalini Awakening, I couldn't look up mysticism, I couldn't look up mystics, so I went to the library, and I came home with stacks and stacks and stacks of books. And much to my surprise, all I had to do was put my hands on the books, and all the information in the books flew off the books into me as though I had written them myself. Because I was so connected to this, what I call this highway, this super highway of consciousness, it was as if I had written those books myself. And so I went through hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of books. And when I started going into different places of worship, into churches, into temples, into other sacred places, all I had to do was put my hands on the books and walk into those places, and I could feel the vibrations of all of humanity in those sacred places of worship. I could feel unconditional love, forgiveness, acceptance. I could also feel fear, terror, despair, all of the emotions in the places. And by the way, when I walked into this church, I felt a beautiful sense of peacefulness and quietude. It was a really very welcoming place to walk into. And I had tears always streaming down my face for the first couple of years, and I called them tears of knowing, because there wasn't a shred of doubt inside of me that what I was knowing and what was being told to me was the absolute truth. So there were a few other things that happened to me, if you want to just move on a little bit. A lot of things would happen to me, and then it would be the experience, and then it would be a challenge for me to try to then find language around it, to explain it in a way that I would be able to understand it in a human body. And I had mentioned before that I had these three incredible teachers. The first one was my rabbi, and then he connected me to the Hindu psychiatrist. So when I would have these experiences, I would call Dr. Badri Ricky on the phone, and I'd say, okay, this is what happened to me. And there's another little, if you can read that. So going back to the slide right before that, there we go. Some of the things that happened to me sounded like hocus pocus. I saw what I later found out was called the blue pearl. And they say when you're fully enlightened, you see the world bathed in this incredible blue light. But what happened to me is I would see a little, like a sesame seed of a blue pearl in the upper left-hand corner of my vision. So just take a moment now to think about this. All of our thoughts are layered. So the loudest ones are usually fear-based. They're usually in the future or the past. You know, if we're in tremendous pain, that gets a lot of attention. Then there's a whole bunch of neutral thoughts that go on in between there, and maybe there'll be another extreme thought, extreme joy, extreme pain. But above all of those thoughts, we always have a consciousness, a higher consciousness that's kind of chirping in our ears, telling us things. And so when I would see the blue pearl, I'd have to stop everything that I was thinking and saying and doing and pay attention to my thoughts. So here's an example of how the blue pearl worked for me. I started working as a healer over 20 years ago, and a woman came in to see me who had a cancer diagnosis, and she was in her 40s, and she had 3 youngish children, and she was terrified, rightfully so. And when she walked in the door, I saw the blue pearl for a split second come right over her shoulder, right as she walked in. And what it was telling me was that she was going to be okay, that she didn't have to worry, that she was not going to die of cancer. And I told her, I said, look, you're going to be okay. And I explained to her about the blue pearl. Well, years later, I found out that the blue pearl was a real thing. I didn't know at the time when I was seeing it. And in fact, there's some great books written about the blue pearl, and one is called The Play of Consciousness by Swami Muktananda. So if any of you are interested now, we can go to the internet and Google the blue pearl, and you'll see there's lots and lots of information that it's a real thing. So when I would have these experiences, I would think, okay, Nance, here we go again. And then later on, I would get an affirmation from the physical world. I talked about some of these other second sight experiences that I had as things were moving along. And then we get to my 3 wise teachers, which you saw. And then the way I started my healing work was my friend Patricia Long, Reverend Patricia Long, who helped me. And I was meeting with her weekly to kind of digest what was happening. Once I started sleeping, I was having mystical visions and mystical dreams, which I kept a dream journal of. They weren't regular dreams. They were dreams of mystical oneness. So I would go to see Patricia quite a bit. Every week I saw her. And she said to me, hey, Nance, we're going to do a healing service at my church this weekend. Would you like to come? I said, sure. And prior to this, I had spoken to Dr. Ricky. He said, you know, Nancy, there's a lot of different paths you can take, because I kept thinking, what am I supposed to do with this gift? I had this feeling of overwhelming responsibility that it wasn't really given just for me. And we talked about, you know, the astral projection and being able to move things energetically. I told someone when we were setting up that in the beginning, I could turn lights off if they were bothering me. I could will them. So I was really electrically wired, and you know, just a lot of things that were very unusual. And Dr. Ricky had laid out a bunch of different things that I could do with some of the psychic abilities. I could have used them as a mediumship or channeling. But when I walked in to help my friend Patricia with her first healing, only one person showed up. And when she came in, I could see how sick she was. She had a very constricted energy, and I could see that she was going to die fairly soon. But when I put my hands on her, again, much to my surprise, I noticed that I could see inside of her body. And I could see what the sickness was. I could see her bones. I could see her organs. And that was my first experience. And when I put my hands on her that day, I knew that I would spend the rest of my lifetime here during this lifetime on earth as a healer. And the first 4 or 5 years I worked for free. I used to take my table to different people's homes. I would have done anything to work as a healer. And many years later, I have worked on hundreds and hundreds of people. So I wanted to share a little bit about my healing experiences. In the beginning, I was taking my table to people's homes, and one time I was working with a man who was the president of a bank. And so his wife, of course, had called me in, and he was very compliant, although, and very kind, although I could see it was way out of his realm of comfort. But I would set my table up in his living room, and the living room was very formal. At the end of the living room, there was a fireplace, and on either side of the fireplace, there were 2 straight-back chairs that looked Asian. You know, they were Oriental. The whole living room had an Oriental flair to it. So when I was working on Randy, oh, did this go off? Can you hear me? When I was working on Randy, in my third eye, I would see an elderly Chinese couple dressed in traditional garb sitting in these chairs. And it was the very beginning of me really understanding that there's always someone there to help you cross over. And it was very clear that this couple was there to help him. But I never said anything to him or his wife. And one day we would go in after the healing, wash my hands in cold water. I'd have Barb wash her hands in cold water. I said, okay, Barb, I want to tell you something, and it's going to be a little bit more expanded than usual. And she said, okay, what? And I told her what I saw. I said, I'm just going to tell you the truth. And in the beginning, when I was telling people things that I saw, I was always a little worried because I didn't want them to be afraid. I didn't want to instill fear in anyone. So she took it in, though. She was a really cool cat, and she said, okay. I said, let's not tell Randy about this. She said, yeah, I don't think that's a good idea. So Randy lived a lot longer than he was supposed to, and he did all kinds of things that he didn't think he would have time to do. But towards the end, he did get sicker and sicker. And the last few weeks of his life, he was at home with hospice, and he was on morphine. And I wasn't going to the house at that point. But one day I got a phone call from Barb, and she said, Nancy, I want you to sit down. I said, okay. She said, I was walking past Randy's room, and his eyes were closed, but he was having a conversation. So I peeked in the room, and I went over to him and gently tapped him on the shoulder, and I said, sweetheart, wake up. Who are you talking to? And she said, he sat up bolt right in his bed. He opened his eyes, and he said, well, I'm talking to this elderly Chinese couple. They're helping me get my affairs in order before I leave. And with that, he went right out. And I thought, okay, I always got a little dog with, I would get a little dog bone. I'd, get a little affirmation in the physical world that what was going on with me inside, my internal experiences were accurate. One of the things that I could see was the angel of death once I started working more in my own healing room. And even today, I still work at my house. I call it the napping house. So my children would be little. They would be asleep upstairs. The cats would be sleeping on my bed. The dog would be sleeping in the kitchen. And I'd have a client on the table, and their energy was coming down and starting to rest. So I called it the napping house. And after many years, especially of having small children and all of their friends in the house, the energy in that room is so clear. But for many years, I could see the angel of death. So if someone came to me, I knew if they were going to be passing soon because the angel of death was there. And the angel of death was magnificent. It stood at the right lower corner by the person's foot, and it had the most enormous light, the most incredible energy, not at all scary. And it would stay there, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months, sometimes over into a year. I would never tell the person on the table what I was seeing because I didn't want to frighten them, and I'm not the creator of all creation. So, but it was pretty clear every time I would see that. So that led me to understand that when we do cross over, there are not only, sometimes they're relatives who have crossed over. Sometimes I think that's just their job up in heaven, like this elderly Chinese couple. I mean, that must be what they do, you know? And the angel of death can be at it's amazing that the angel of death could be at so many different locations when you think about all the people that die around the world on a daily basis. So no one ever leaves here alone. We're all incredibly, my belief, internal beliefs tells me, and experiences tell me that we're all very guided and guarded, incredibly loved exactly as we are, and that we are always waiting. The spirit world is always waiting for us to pay attention. So they're always kind of chattering in our ear. But a lot of times we don't have the stillness inside of us to be able to hear. So I was talking to someone earlier today and I said, well, you know, God can't really reach me on the phone if I'm always talking, you know? So I wanted to just talk a little bit about my clients, if you want to just, there we go. I love my clients. I've had a tremendous amount of people that have come to see me that have cancer, and for some reason, for the first 10 years of my healing work, I could see tumors and I could draw pictures of them. And eventually I went back to school and learned about anatomy and physiology, and learned about, because I wanted to know more about what I was seeing inside the body. So I've had lots of cancer clients over the years. Some have lived. I still have some that are 15, 20 years out of that experience, and some of them have crossed over. I've worked with people that have ALS. I call myself a bottom feeder. People come to see me when they're desperate, when everything else has failed, mostly. Broken bones are really easy because they're so solid, so they were really easy to see them, and I could knit them back together in my mind's eye. I could do that work. Surgery prep. I love to prepare people for surgeries. I've had 7 surgeries, and they were the very best days of my life because I had something that could be fixed. And to me, that was so miraculous. And to be living in an area where there were incredible doctors, nurses, medicine, because I believe that Western medicine is a gift as well as all of the healing arts. And so I love doing surgery prep and working on gratitude and helping people just see things a little bit differently, allaying some of their fears. Infertility, I love working with moms that are trying to get pregnant. The most recent woman that I've been working with was 41. She's a physician. Her husband's a physician. They tried in vitro fertilization a number of times, and she's now pregnant after coming to see me. So that's always really happy. For me, death is as exhilarating as birth. So it's either side of the spectrum, because when you're coming into the world, in Judaism, they believe that the veil is pulled down over your eyes, and that the process of your life is allowing you to become a greater version of who you already are, and to remember who you are, to remember your goodness, your kindness, your compassion, your forgiveness, your special gifts, your special talents. And when we get to that place of self-love, we are then much more able to go out into the world and share that with other people who are in pain or who are living in fear. So, and of course, anxiety and depression. I love helping people begin to see things differently, to understand things differently, to wake up feeling grateful, to know that when we change the way we look at things, the things we look at can change. So I work a lot with gratitude and a lot with helping people understand that their thoughts are always changing and that we can't always choose the thoughts that drop down into our heads, but we can choose what we're going to do with those thoughts. And so I like to help people learn how to change the channel in their brain and give them some positive things to think about. And it's a practice. It takes a long, long time to begin to change some of those thought patterns that were instilled in us by very oftentimes loving, caring parents, grandparents, caregivers, but maybe didn't have a very healthy skill set to pass down to us. So in yoga, they call these thought patterns samskaras. So they're like well-worn grooves that we've been thinking about over and over and over since we were children. And you'll notice sometimes how a problem will get stuck in your head and we perseverate in the problem. I like to help people learn how to live in the solutions of the problems that they create, because I do believe that we all create our own problems, and that for every problem that we do create, there is a solution. So I love to work with anxiety and depression on that. And there we go. There's another cute little cartoon. It says, "Are you not thinking what I'm not thinking?" And you can see there's a picture of a brain that's heated and very busy, and it's before meditation. And then after meditation, you can see how the brain has cooled down. And so I love to teach healing meditations because I can see in the room the energy. People will come in, their energy will be like this, their shoulders will be up around their ears, their hands are clenched, their legs are crossed, their arms are crossed. And as you move through the healing meditations, everything starts to calm down. The hands unclench, the teeth unclench, your legs begin to uncross, your brain begins to rest. And when the brain begins to rest, then the body can really take good care of itself. The immune system kicks in, the central nervous system spreads out. There's all these wonderful things that happen to you scientifically when we begin to slow down our thinking and open our heart centers. So I've had people come to me on my healing table with blood pressure cuffs so that they could measure their blood pressure before and after, and there's always a huge difference. And so all of the meditations that I teach are what I call healing meditations. A lot of them were channeled to me over the years, and I've recorded a bunch of them. And I'm teaching a meditation workshop tomorrow for anyone that's interested. I'm not exactly sure where it is, but it's from 10 to 12. And I will be going through one of my favorite meditations, which is called the Prayer for Loving Kindness. But I'll also be doing a short forgiveness meditation and a short breathing meditation. And I'm going to start with just a quick body scan, a relaxation meditation. And there'll be some interactive meditations so that everyone will be able to get up and see what it's like to use your hands to heal not only yourself but others, because I do believe that that is a God-given gift that we all have. So here we go, on to the next one. Healing is sometimes emotional, physical, or hopefully the healing is always spiritual. When people come to see me, I say to them, I'm a spiritual healer, and there's always a spiritual healing. But because I'm not your creator, and I'm not the face of God, I'm not I'm merely a channel for this experience that I had. I have a visceral memory in my body of what it was like to be enfolded in that unconditional love. And because I have a visceral memory of that, I can help you remember that feeling inside of yourself. So sometimes there is a physical healing, and I've had some pretty amazing physical healings for people in all different ways. Cancer tumors that have melted, broken bones that have healed much more quickly. There are certain things that are much easier for me to work with, but it doesn't always happen. And I'd never want anyone to come to my healing table expecting that I can physically heal them, because it's not always best for that spirit to be healed. Sometimes, and because I don't see death as something that is scary, I don't see it as the booby prize. I see it as the all-encompassing love. I can help people to allay their fears of their death and dying process. One of the things that I've done over the years is I do healing circles for people who are dying, where we'll gather all of their loved ones together and we'll get a chance to talk and say what you mean from your heart before the person passes. A lot of times that's saved for funerals, and a lot of spirits do show up at funerals. I see them like big orbs of light. Sometimes they don't show up, but sometimes they do. But it's nice to be able to tell the people that we love how much we love them while they're still alive. And it doesn't have to be on a deathbed. But I don't like to set up false expectations for when people come to see me for healings. And I also wanted to let you know that it took me many, many years. It took me almost 20 years to write my story down on paper, because it took me a long time to integrate it. And when I wrote the book, I knew as soon as I got some language around it that I would write the story down someday. And I said to my kids, what I'm going to do is I'm going to write the story down, and then after I die, you can publish it. And they said, no, Mom, no, you're not getting off the hook that easily. So for me, in a way, it was like coming out of the closet, because a lot of my experiences sound like hocus pocus, like magical thinking, and yet I'm just not that creative. I couldn't make these things up. So after I wrote the book, I did get a lot of wonderful press in the Boston area, and lots of television interviews, radio interviews, and it felt like I was coming out of the closet in some ways. For me, there's always a yearning to return home, and the first few years after the awakening, I went to see my rabbi a few times, and I said, I can't wait to go home. What am I doing here in this body? I want to go home. And he told me, and I knew as well, that it wasn't my time. He gave me a beautiful book to read called The Four Who Entered Paradise, which I love this story. And I'll end with this story tonight. There's 4 rabbis, and they go to heaven. They climb the ladder to heaven. They found Jacob's ladder. They go to heaven. And while they're there, they just cannot believe it. It's the most incredible place they've ever been in. And even though, like I said before, there's really no time in this, because it's outside the box of space and time that we know here, that we construct here on Earth, but for the sake of the story, time passes. And they know that they have to make a decision. They either have to come back to earth or stay in heaven. So each rabbi makes a different decision. The first rabbi says, no way. There is no way I'm leaving this place. I am staying here forever. I'm not going back down there. The second rabbi says, well, I'll go back down there, but I'm going to leave my spirit in heaven, and I'll bring my body back down to earth. So he walks the rest of his days like a shell of a person. And I think there are people on earth that have have their spirits in heaven, and you sometimes meet them. Sometimes they're in our institutions, sometimes they're in our medical facilities, sometimes they have a hard time living in the world. And the third rabbi said, well, I'll go back down to earth. It's okay. I can handle it. But when he gets back down to earth, what he experienced in heaven was so enormous that he can't function in the world. It's almost as though you would try to pour the entire ocean into a thimble. It doesn't fit. It doesn't fit inside of our intellect. So he becomes a heretic and renounces all faith because he can't intellectualize the experience. And then, of course, in all of the stories, Rabbi Akiva, he's always the smartest rabbi, he says, well, I'll go back down to earth, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to spend the rest of my days here on earth drawing down from heaven what I learned and sharing it with people. And I thought, okay, that's what I'm going to do. As soon as my kids are old enough and I know they're moving in their right direction, I will write a book. I'll go out and I will share my story. And if I can help even one person feel more comfortable, less fearful, more loving, more kind, more compassionate, first and foremost to themselves, and then they can go out into the world and spread that unconditional love, then I've done a great job. So with that, I'm going to close, and very, very grateful. Thank you for having me here tonight.